Hello, my name is Isaac Moreno. I'm 35 years old, and I live a life that most people would probably find unremarkable. A modest apartment in downtown Portland, a quiet routine, and a reputation for being the family disappointment. But if you ask me about the journey that brought me to this particular Christmas dinner, I would tell you a story that is far more complicated than it appears on the surface. The Moreno family home sits like a monument to success in the hills overlooking the city. When I pulled into the circular driveway that December evening, the house was draped in warm, golden lights, every window glowing with the kind of perfection that money can buy. Fresh wreaths hung from every door, and the scent of expensive pine arrangements drifted through the cold air. To any passerby, it would look like the picture of holiday joy. But as I sat in my 10-year-old Honda Civic watching my breath fog the windshield, I felt like an intruder preparing to enter a museum where I didn't belong. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I hadn't been back for Christmas in 3 years. There were always excuses, work commitments, travel plans, anything to avoid sitting at that polished mahogany table where I was perpetually reminded of everything I supposedly wasn't. But Lena had called me 2 weeks ago, her voice carrying that familiar mix of hope and worry. "Please come, Isaac," she'd said. "It's been too long and I miss you." Lena was the only one who ever said things like that, the only one who seemed to notice when I wasn't there. The front door opened before I could even knock. Ronald Moreno stood there in his perfectly pressed sweater, his silver hair combed back with mathematical precision. At 62, he still carried himself like the finance executive he'd been for 30 years, every gesture calculated to project authority and success. "Isaac," he said, his smile tight and practiced, "you made it." "Hello, Ronald." I'd stopped calling him Dad years ago, though neither of us ever acknowledged the shift. "Thank you for having me." He stepped aside to let me in, and I was immediately enveloped by the familiar mixture of expensive cologne, fresh flowers, and something else. The subtle tension that always seemed to hang in the air of this house like a fine mist. Marcia appeared from the living room, elegant, as always, in her cream-colored dress, her dark hair styled in the same perfect wave she'd worn for as long as I could remember. She had been beautiful once, probably still was, but there was something hollow in her smile, something that never quite reached her eyes when she looked at me. "Isaac, sweetheart," she said, offering her cheek for the obligatory kiss. "You look thin. Are you eating enough?" It was the same question she'd asked me for 28 years, delivered in the same tone that managed to sound caring, while somehow suggesting I was incapable of taking care of myself. I wanted to tell her that I'd been eating just fine, that I'd been taking care of myself and others better than she could possibly imagine. Instead, I smiled and said, "I'm doing well, Marcia." Before the awkwardness could settle too deeply, I heard footsteps on the stairs, and Lena appeared like a burst of genuine warmth in the sterile perfection. At 28, she had inherited Marcia's beauty but none of her coldness. Her face lit up when she saw me, and for the first time since I'd walked through the door, I felt like someone was actually happy I was there. "Isaac!" She wrapped me in a hug that felt real, pressing something small into my hand as she pulled away. A folded piece of paper. "I'm so glad you came," she whispered, her eyes sparkling with something that looked suspiciously like mischief. The sound of expensive shoes on marble announced Ethan's arrival before I saw him. My older adoptive brother descended the grand staircase like he was making an entrance at a premiere, his tailored shirt open at the collar, his dark hair perfectly tousled in that way that probably took him 20 minutes to achieve. At 38, Ethan had perfected the art of looking successful, from his Swiss watch to his Italian leather shoes. "Well, well," he said, his voice carrying that familiar note of condescension wrapped in false joviality. "Look who decided to grace us with his presence. The prodigal son returns." I managed a neutral smile. "Hello, Ethan." He clapped me on the shoulder with just a little too much force, the way he always did, a gesture that looked friendly but felt like a reminder of hierarchy. "Good to see you, little brother. How's the computer thing going?" The computer thing. 20 years of building software. creating solutions, changing lives, and it was still just the computer thing to him. I was about to respond when the front door burst open with a gust of cold air and laughter. "Sorry I'm late." Uncle Trevor's voice boomed through the foyer as he kicked snow off his boots. At 55, Trevor was Ronald's younger brother, and everything Ronald wasn't, rumpled, irreverent, and completely unbothered by the family's obsession with appearances. His gray beard was slightly unkempt, his flannel shirt wrinkled, and his eyes held the kind of humor that came from seeing through people's pretenses. "Traffic was murder," he announced, pulling off his coat and revealing a sweater that might have been fashionable in 1987. "And by traffic I mean I stopped at Murphy's for a beer because I needed fortification for another Moreno family gathering." Marcia looked mortified, but I caught the hint of a smile tugging at Lena's lips. Trevor had always been the truth-teller in the family, the one person who refused to pretend that everything was perfect. "Trevor," Ronald said, his voice carrying a warning. "Ronald," Trevor replied, matching his brother's tone exactly. Then he looked at me and grinned. "Isaac!" "Good to see you, kid. Ready for another evening of wholesome family bonding?" The sarcasm in his voice was so thick you could cut it with a knife, and for the first time since I'd arrived, I felt myself relax just slightly. At least I wasn't the only one who saw through the facade. "Dinner's ready," Marcia announced, clearly eager to move everyone toward the dining room before Trevor could make any more observations about family dynamics. As we made our way toward the sound of clinking crystal and muted conversation, I unfolded the note Lena had pressed into my hand. In her careful handwriting it read, "I know who you really are. It's time they did too." My blood ran cold. I looked up to find Lena watching me, her expression gentle but determined. She gave me the slightest nod, and I realized that this Christmas dinner was going to be very different from the ones I'd endured before. The dining room awaited, with its gleaming table set for 6, candles flickering over expensive china and crystal glasses that caught the light like tiny prisons. I took my usual seat, the one at the far end, as far from Ronald as possible, and prepared myself for what was about to unfold. As I watched my family settle into their chairs, laughing and chatting about trivial things, I couldn't help but think about how none of them had any idea that the man they considered their greatest failure had been quietly holding their world together for years. The irony was almost beautiful in its cruelty. But looking at Lena's encouraging smile and Trevor's knowing glance, I realized that maybe, just maybe, tonight would be the night that changed everything. The conversation started pleasantly enough, the way it always did. Polite inquiries about the weather, compliments on Marcia's cooking, Trevor's jokes about his perpetually single status. But I could feel the undercurrent, the way Ronald kept glancing at me with that look I knew so well, the one that said he was preparing to make a point at my expense. It didn't take long. "So, Ethan," Ronald said, carving the prime rib with surgical precision, "tell Isaac about the Morrison development deal. I'm sure he'd find it educational." Ethan's chest puffed up like a peacock displaying its feathers. "Well, it's actually quite impressive," he began, launching into a detailed description of a luxury residential project that I happened to know had been funded through one of my shell companies. Every word that came out of his mouth was technically true, but the underlying reality, that his success existed only because I had quietly arranged the financing, made my stomach turn. 37 units, all pre-sold, Ethan continued, gesturing with his wineglass. We're looking at a profit margin of 43%. Not bad for 6 months' work. Outstanding, Ronald beamed, his pride so genuine it almost made me feel sorry for him. Almost. That's what happens when you apply yourself, when you understand what real work looks like. The implied contrast hung in the air like smoke. Marcia shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her fork pushing food around her plate without actually eating. She knew what was coming. We all did. Isaac, Ronald continued, his voice taking on that patronizing tone that had haunted my childhood. Perhaps Ethan could give you some pointers on business development. It's never too late to learn from someone who's actually accomplished something. The words hit their intended mark. But instead of the familiar sting of humiliation, I felt something else, a strange calm, like the moment before a storm breaks. Lena's note was still folded in my pocket, her words echoing in my mind. It's time they did too. That's very generous of you to offer, I said quietly, my voice steady despite the rage building in my chest. Trevor's eyebrows rose slightly, and I caught him studying me with new interest. He'd always been perceptive, always seemed to see things others missed. Isaac's being modest, Lena interjected suddenly, her voice carrying an edge I rarely heard from her. He's actually been quite busy with his own projects. Ronald's smile was sharp as a blade. Oh yes, the mysterious computer work. Tell us, Isaac, what exactly is it that you do again? Besides disappoint your family, I mean. The table fell silent except for the soft clink of crystal and the distant sound of holiday music playing from the living room. This was it, the moment I'd dreaded and somehow anticipated for years, the moment when everything would either change forever or break apart completely. I looked around the table at these people who had shaped my life in ways they couldn't begin to understand. At Ronald's smug satisfaction, Marcia's guilty discomfort, Ethan's oblivious arrogance, Lena's quiet encouragement, and Trevor's knowing smirk. Actually, I said, setting down my fork with deliberate care, there's something I think you should know about that. But before I could say another word, the weight of memory crashed over me like a wave. I was 7 years old again, standing in this same dining room for the first time, clutching a worn, stuffed bear while Marcia explained in her careful voice that I was part of the family now. I remember thinking the house was so big, so clean, so different from the cramped foster homes I'd known. I thought I'd finally found where I belonged. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. How wrong I was. The memories came in fragments, each one a small cut that had never quite healed. 8 years old, bringing home straight A's, only to watch Ronald barely glance at the report card before turning his attention to Ethan's mediocre soccer trophy. 10 years old, winning the state science fair and hearing Marcia tell her friends that Isaac is very smart, but Ethan has such natural leadership abilities. 12 years old, listening through the walls as my parents discussed whether my antisocial tendencies might require professional help. I was never antisocial. I was just tired of trying to earn love that was never going to come. College had been my escape, though they'd made sure it was a struggle. While Ethan went to Stanford on the family dime, I worked 3 jobs to pay for community college, then transferred to Portland State. That's where I met Professor Chen, who saw something in my coding that even I didn't fully understand. Late nights in the computer lab became my sanctuary, lines of code flowing like poetry under my fingers. Penelope started as a class project, a simple AI assistant designed to help city planners optimize traffic patterns. But she evolved, learning and adapting in ways that surprised even me. By my senior year, she could predict infrastructure failures, optimize energy consumption, and coordinate emergency responses across entire metropolitan areas. Cities started paying attention. Big cities. Cities with big budgets. I sold Penelope 3 days after graduation for $8.7 million. Not to some Silicon Valley giant, but to a consortium of urban planners who promised to keep her focused on public good rather than profit. I used a shell company, a lawyer who specialized in anonymous transactions, and a pseudonym I'd created years earlier. Isaac Moreno, the family failure, had no connection to Thomas Park, the mysterious tech entrepreneur who just changed the game for urban infrastructure management. The first check I wrote from that money was to clear Ronald's mounting debts from his failed real estate ventures. The second went to fund Ethan's, quote, investment opportunities. The third covered Marcia's expensive medical treatments when she'd been too proud to admit the family insurance had lapsed. They never knew. They never even asked where the anonymous grants and lucky breaks were coming from. Looking at their faces now, seeing Ronald's condescending smile and Ethan's oblivious pride, I realized that the boy who'd once desperately wanted their approval had finally died somewhere along the way. In his place sat a man who no longer needed their validation to know his own worth. "There's something I think you should know," I repeated, my voice growing stronger with each word. But Ronald wasn't finished with his performance. He leaned back in his chair, swirling his wine with the satisfaction of a man who believed he held all the cards. "Before Isaac enlightens us with whatever revelation he thinks he has," Ronald said, his voice dripping with mockery, "I'd like to propose a toast to Ethan, who's shown us what it means to be a real contributor to this family's legacy." Ethan raised his glass, his face flushed with wine and pride. "Well, since we're celebrating achievements, I might as well share the good news. The Morrison project isn't just profitable, it's opening doors. 3 more developments are already in the pipeline, including that waterfront property downtown. We're talking about a potential $50 million portfolio within 2 years. Every word felt like a knife twist. I knew those projects intimately, had reviewed every business plan, every financial projection, every risk assessment. My money had made them possible. My careful anonymous investments had given Ethan the credibility to attract other investors. His natural business acumen was built entirely on a foundation I'd constructed from the shadows. "Remarkable," Marcia breathed, her eyes shining with maternal pride. "I always knew you had your grandfather's gift for business." "Unlike some people," Ronald added, his gaze settling on me like a weight, "who seem content to drift through life without purpose or ambition. Isaac, you're 35 years old. Don't you think it's time you stopped being a parasite and started contributing something meaningful to this family?" The word parasite hung in the air like a slap. Around the table, I watched the reactions. Marcia's sharp intake of breath, Lena's hands clenching into fists, Trevor's eyebrows shooting up in surprise at his brother's cruelty. But it was Ethan's reaction that broke something inside me. He was nodding, actually nodding in agreement. "Dad's right," Ethan said, his voice carrying the casual authority of someone who'd never been challenged. "I mean, we all want you to succeed, Isaac, but at some point, you have to take responsibility for your own life. You can't keep expecting the family to carry you forever." The irony was so perfect, so beautifully twisted, that I almost laughed. Here was Ethan, whose entire lifestyle depended on my anonymous generosity, lecturing me about responsibility. Here was Ronald, whose debts I'd paid, calling me a parasite. Here was the family I'd quietly supported for years, united in their conviction that I was the burden they had to bear. "Expecting the family to carry me," I repeated slowly, tasting each word. "That's an interesting way to put it." Trevor was watching me with laser focus now, his usual humor replaced by something sharper, more alert. Lena had gone very still, her dark eyes fixed on my face with an expression that looked almost like anticipation. The moment stretched between us, heavy with the weight of years of accumulated pain and swallowed truths. I could feel my heartbeat in my ears, could hear the soft tick of the antique clock on the mantel counting out the seconds until everything changed. "You know what?" I said, setting my napkin beside my plate with deliberate care. "I think I need some air." "Running away again?" Ronald called after me as I stood. "How predictably Isaac of you." I paused in the doorway, my hand on the frame, and looked back at him. "I'll be right back, Ronald. We're not finished here." Not even close. The cold December air hit my face like a blessing. I stood on the back patio, gripping the railing and staring out at the city lights twinkling below. My breath came out in white puffs, and for the first time in hours I could think clearly. The weight of their words, parasite, failure, burden, pressed down on my shoulders, but underneath the familiar pain was something new, a burning certainty that this charade had to end. The patio door slid open behind me, and I didn't need to turn around to know it was Lena. She'd always been the one to follow, the one to check on me when the family gatherings became too much to bear. "Isaac," her voice was soft, careful. "Are you okay?" I let out a bitter laugh. Define okay. She moved to stand beside me, wrapping her coat tighter around herself. "I meant what I wrote in that note," she said quietly. "I know who you really are." My hands tightened on the railing. "Lena." Thomas Park, she interrupted, her voice barely above a whisper. The anonymous developer behind Penelope. The mysterious investor who's been funding urban infrastructure projects across the Pacific Northwest. I've been following the work for 3 years, Isaac. The coding signature, the approach to problem solving, the way the AI learns and adapts. It's brilliant. And it's yours. I turned to look at her, this woman who'd somehow seen through every wall I'd built. How long have you known? Suspected? About a year. Knew for certain. 2 months ago, when I found the patent filings under your legal name buried in the public records. She smiled, and there was pride in her eyes. Real pride, the kind I'd never seen from anyone else in this family. Isaac, what you created is being used in 43 cities worldwide. You've probably saved thousands of lives through better emergency response coordination alone. The validation hit me harder than I'd expected. For years, I'd watched my work make a difference from the shadows. Never able to claim credit, never able to share the satisfaction of seeing Penelope help optimize disaster relief in Puerto Rico or prevent a subway tunnel collapse in Seattle. Why didn't you say anything? I asked. Because I was waiting for you to be ready to say it yourself. Lena reached out and touched my arm. But Isaac, you can't keep letting them define your worth. You're not their failure. You're their salvation, whether they deserve it or not. They'll never believe it, I said. And even if they do, it won't change anything. They'll just find new ways to diminish it. Maybe, she agreed. But this isn't about them anymore, is it? This is about you finally standing up and claiming who you are. You've spent years taking care of everyone else. When do you start taking care of yourself? I looked back through the patio door at the warm light of the dining room, where I could see Ronald gesturing animatedly, probably still holding court about my many failures. The irony was exquisite. The man they'd written off as worthless had been quietly holding their world together for years. They called me a parasite, I said, the words still burning in my throat. Then show them who the real parasite is, Lena said fiercely. Show them the truth, Isaac, all of it. I nodded slowly, feeling something shift inside my chest. A door opening, a weight lifting. You're right, it's time. As we walked back toward the house, I felt lighter than I had in years. Not because the truth would fix everything, but because I was finally ready to stop apologizing for being exactly who I was. When Lena and I returned to the dining room, the conversation had somehow circled back to my shortcomings. Ronald was in full lecture mode, his voice carrying that familiar tone of disappointment mixed with superiority. The problem with Isaac, he was saying to Trevor as if I weren't about to walk back into the room, is that he's never understood what it means to be part of something bigger than himself. Success requires sacrifice, commitment, the willingness to put family legacy ahead of personal comfort. I slid back into my seat, feeling strangely calm. The anger was still there, but it had crystallized into something harder, more focused. Lena caught my eye and gave me the slightest nod of encouragement. Speaking of family legacy, Ethan chimed in, refilling his wine glass. I've been thinking about expanding into commercial properties. There's this office complex downtown that would be perfect for our portfolio. The financing's already lined up through some private investor group. Another one of my projects, another piece of my money that he was claiming as his own vision. That's my boy, Ronald beamed. Always thinking ahead, always building on success. Unlike some people who seem determined to squander every opportunity they're given. Ronald, I said quietly, my voice cutting through his monologue like a blade. He turned to me with that patronizing smile I knew so well. Yes, Isaac. Do you have something to contribute to this conversation about actual achievement? Actually, I do. I leaned back in my chair, meeting his gaze steadily. I've been listening to you talk about Ethan's business acumen, about family legacy, about who contributes and who takes, and I think it's time you knew something. The table went quiet. Even Trevor stopped chewing, his fork suspended halfway to his mouth. For the past 8 years, I continued, my voice growing stronger with each word. Every major investment Ethan has made, every lucky break this family has experienced, every anonymous grant that's appeared just when you needed it most, all of it has come from me. Ethan's wine glass stopped halfway to his lips. What are you talking about? I'm talking about the Morrison development. I'm talking about the downtown office complex you just mentioned. I'm talking about the mysterious private investor group that's been funding your dreams. I smiled, and it felt sharp and dangerous. Congratulations, Ethan, you've built your entire career on my money. The silence that followed was deafening. Ronald's face had gone white, then red, then white again. Marcia's hand had flown to her throat. Ethan was staring at me like I'd just spoken in a foreign language. That's impossible, Ronald said finally, his voice barely controlled. You're a failure? I finished. A parasite? A disappointment? I stood up, my hands flat on the table. No, Ronald, I'm the person who's been keeping this family afloat while you called me worthless. Trevor set down his fork and leaned back in his chair, a slow grin spreading across his face. Well, I'll be damned. You're lying, Ethan said, his voice shaking. This is some kind of sick joke. I pulled out my phone with deliberate calm, scrolling through the banking app I rarely opened in public. Morrison Development received its initial funding from Cascade Holdings, LLC in March of 2019, $2.3 million. I looked up at Ethan's increasingly pale face. Cascade Holdings is one of my shell companies. Would you like to see the wire transfer receipts? Ronald slammed his hand on the table, making the crystal glasses ring. This is absurd. If you had that kind of money, why would you live in a modest apartment, drive an old car, dress like someone who shops at thrift stores? I shrugged. Because I don't need marble countertops and designer clothes to know my worth. Unlike some people. Marcia finally found her voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. Isaac, if this is true, then how? How did the family failure become a millionaire? I sat back down, enjoying the way they were all leaning forward now, hanging on my every word. I created something called Penelope, an artificial intelligence system that revolutionized urban infrastructure management. You might have heard of it. It's currently running traffic optimization in Portland, disaster response coordination in San Francisco, and emergency services routing in 41 other cities worldwide. Trevor let out a low whistle. Penelope. That's the system that prevented the water main disaster in Seattle last year, isn't it? Saved the city about $50 million in damage. $57 million, actually, I corrected. But who's counting? Ethan was staring at his hands now, the pieces falling into place. The private investor meetings, the phone calls I never sat in on, the contracts that always seemed to work out perfectly. All arranged by me, I confirmed. Through intermediaries, lawyers, and shell companies. I've been your silent partner for 8 years, Ethan. Every success you've claimed, every deal you've celebrated, every moment of pride Ronald has shown in your achievements, all of it built on my foundation. The weight of revelation settled over the table like a heavy blanket. Ronald looked like he'd aged 10 years in the span of 10 minutes. Marcia was crying silently, her perfect makeup running down her cheeks. Ethan had put his head in his hands. But why? Marcia asked through her tears. If you had all this, why didn't you tell us? I looked at each of them in turn. These people who had shaped my life through their neglect, their dismissal, their casual cruelty. Because I kept hoping that someday you might love me for who I was, not for what I could give you. I kept thinking that maybe if I just tried hard enough, if I was patient enough, if I proved myself worthy in ways you couldn't see. I trailed off, shaking my head. But tonight, listening to you call me a parasite while sitting in a house I've helped pay for, wearing clothes bought with money I earned, celebrating successes I made possible, I realized I was done waiting for your approval. Trevor raised his glass with a sardonic smile. Well, I'll be damned. Looks like the family failure was the one keeping everyone else from failing. The silence stretched until Ronald finally exploded. How dare you? He roared, his face crimson with rage and humiliation. How dare you sit there and make us look like fools? If this is true, then you've been manipulating us for years, playing some twisted game. Manipulating you? I stood up so fast, my chair scraped against the floor. I kept you from losing your house when your investments went south in 2018. I covered Marcia's medical bills when your insurance lapsed. I funded every opportunity Ethan ever had because I couldn't bear to watch him fail. even when he treated me like garbage. That's not manipulation, Ronald. That's love. Twisted, one-sided, pathetic love, but love nonetheless. You made us look like charity cases, Ronald's voice cracked with wounded pride. You made yourselves charity cases, I shot back, my own voice rising for the first time in years. I just couldn't stand watching you struggle while pretending I didn't exist. Do you have any idea what it's like to watch your family celebrate successes you made possible while they call you worthless? Do you know what it feels like to be invisible in your own home? Marcia was sobbing openly now, her hands covering her face. Isaac, we never knew. You never asked. The words came out harsher than I intended, but I was past caring about their feelings. In 28 years, not one of you ever asked what I actually did for work. Not one of you wondered how I paid my bills, or what I thought about, or what mattered to me. You just decided I was a failure and treated me accordingly. Ethan finally looked up, his eyes red-rimmed. Isaac, God, I'm so sorry, all those things I said, the way I talked down to you. You called me a parasite tonight, I said quietly. You agreed with Ronald that I was a burden this family had to carry. Your entire lifestyle, your car, your house, your reputation, exists because I couldn't let you fail, and you called me a parasite. Lena stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. That's enough, she said, her voice shaking with fury. All of you should be ashamed. Isaac has been taking care of this family for years while you treated him like he was nothing. He doesn't owe you explanations or apologies. You owe him. Lena, Ronald started. No, she interrupted, her voice cutting through the room like a whip. You don't get to speak. You called your own son a parasite while he was quietly holding your world together. You want to talk about family legacy? Isaac is the legacy. Everything good this family has accomplished in the past decade has his fingerprints on it. Trevor nodded slowly, his expression grave. The girl's right. You've been calling the golden goose a failure while living off his eggs. I looked around the table at these people who had defined my worth for so long, seeing them clearly for perhaps the first time. They looked smaller somehow, diminished by the truth I'd finally spoken. I don't want your gratitude, I said quietly. I don't want your apologies. I just want you to stop pretending I'm something I'm not. The storm passed slowly, like weather moving across the mountains. After the shouting, after the tears, after Trevor's pointed observations about golden geese and wounded pride, we sat in the ruins of our Christmas dinner, picking at the pieces of what we'd once pretended was a family. Marcia was the first to move. She stood quietly, walked around the table, and placed her hand on my shoulder. Her touch was tentative, as if she was afraid I might pull away. Isaac, she whispered, her voice thick with tears, I failed you, as a mother, as a person. I failed you completely. I looked up at her, this woman who had never quite known how to love me, who had chosen the safer path of indifference over the risk of genuine connection. For the first time, I saw something real in her eyes, not the perfect hostess mask, not the social anxiety about appearances, but actual regret. You did, I said simply. There was no point in lying about it anymore. But I'm not that 7-year-old boy anymore, Marcia. I don't need you to fix it. She nodded, understanding passing between us like a fragile bridge. I know, but I needed to say it. Ethan cleared his throat, his voice rough. Isaac, I don't know how to... everything I thought I knew about myself. He ran his hands through his perfectly styled hair, making it stand up in messy spikes. I've been such an ass to you. For years. And the whole time, you were. Taking care of you, I finished, because despite everything, you're my brother. Stupid, arrogant, completely oblivious to your own privilege, but still my brother. A laugh escaped him, short, bitter, but somehow hopeful. I don't deserve that kind of loyalty. No, I agreed, you don't. But that's the thing about family. It's not about what we deserve. Lena moved to sit beside me, her presence warm and comforting. You know what I love most about this? She said, her voice lighter than it had been all evening. Isaac just proved that success isn't about recognition or status or even money. It's about integrity, It's about doing the right thing even when no one's watching, even when no one appreciates it. Trevor raised his glass, still half full of wine. To Isaac, he said with that dry smile of his, the only one of us who actually figured out what family means. Even Ronald, deflated and quiet in his chair, raised his glass with shaking hands. I looked around the table at these flawed, complicated people who had hurt me in ways they were only beginning to understand. The anger was still there. Probably always would be. But underneath it, something new was growing. Not forgiveness, exactly, but acceptance. Of who they were, of who I was, of what we could and couldn't be to each other. Next year's dinner is definitely going to be awkward, I said. Trevor snorted with laughter. Kid, after tonight, every family gathering is going to be awkward. Might as well embrace it. 3 weeks later, I sat in my quiet Portland apartment, watching the rain streak down the windows, while I reviewed grant applications for the Moreno Foundation, a new charitable organization I'd established to support foster children transitioning to independence. The irony of the name wasn't lost on me, but some stories deserve to be rewritten. The Christmas dinner had changed everything and nothing. The family dynamic would never be the same, but healing was a slow process, like code debugging. You fix one problem, only to discover 3 more underneath. Still, there were small signs of progress. Ethan had started asking about my work, genuine questions about urban planning and AI development. Marcia sent awkward but heartfelt text messages, checking on my well-being. Even Ronald had managed a stilted conversation about the weather that didn't include any veiled insults. My phone buzzed with a message from Lena. New Year's Eve at Trevor's Jazz Club. You, me, and Uncle T. No parents, no pressure, just music and overpriced drinks. Please say yes. I smiled, typing back, only if you promise not to make any more dramatic revelations. That's your specialty now. Mine is just being proud of my brother. Brother. The word still caught me off guard sometimes, but in a good way. A new email notification popped up, and I almost deleted it without reading until I saw the sender. Ronald.Moreno@morenoproperties.com. The subject line was simple. Thank you. The message was even simpler. I don't know how to be the father you deserved, but I'm trying to learn how to be the father you need now. Thank you for everything. Dad? Dad. He'd never called himself that in an email before. I leaned back in my chair, watching the city lights blur through the rain. Portland was growing, changing, becoming more efficient and resilient, partly because of Penelope's quiet work behind the scenes. Tomorrow, I'd review proposals for 3 more cities, interested in implementing the system. Thousands of people would be safer, traffic would flow better, emergency responses would be faster, and none of them would ever know my name. That used to bother me. Now, it felt like freedom. The Foundation's first scholarship recipient would start college in the fall, a brilliant kid from foster care who reminded me of myself at 18. Unlike me, she wouldn't have to work 3 jobs to pay for her education. Unlike me, she'd know from the beginning that someone believed in her potential. I opened my laptop and began typing a response to Ronald's email. Some conversations required code, some required silence, and some required the simple truth spoken plainly. Thank you for trying, I wrote. That's all any of us can do. Quote, outside, Portland glittered in the rain, and somewhere in the network of traffic lights and emergency dispatch systems, Penelope was quietly making the world a little bit better, just like her creator had learned to do, one invisible act of care at a time. Up next, we have 2 more incredible stories that are waiting for you. Just click the image you want to watch and it will take you there. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe. It would mean a lot.